The goal of today is to ensure each jurisdiction understands their roles and responsibilities in capacity planning and to jumpstart the required collaboration between the county and the jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So in 2016, SB 1383 became law. It set methane emission reduction targets in a statewide effort to reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants. The targets in the law must reduce organic waste disposal by 75% by 2025 and also rescue for people to eat at least 20% of currently disposed surplus food by 2025. The law requires jurisdictions to conduct capacity planning for both organics recycling capacity and for commercial edible food recovery. California has approximately 186 active composting facilities with 35 permitted to accept food waste. We have 13 anaerobic digestion facilities or AD facilities accepting solid waste. We also have a large number of wastewater treatment plants that could be leveraged for co-digestion of food waste. CalRecycle estimates we need 50 to 100 new or expanded facilities to recycle an additional 20 to 25 million tons of organic waste annually. So this emphasizes the importance of organic capacity planning for jurisdictions to meet the need. Expanding edible food recovery capacity is also necessary for a number of jurisdictions. A CalRecycle study estimated approximately 1.1 million tons of potentially donatable food was disposed in landfills, and this was in 2018. The study suggests at least 225,000 tons of edible food would need to be recovered to meet the 1383 food recovery goals. Food recovery organizations that receive food recovery grants reported to have the capacity to rescue at least 80,000 tons of edible food per year statewide. But even with the studies and the data from the grant recipients, future data will be necessary to truly determine how much food was edible and could have been consumed at the time of disposal. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to be covering the organic waste recycling capacity planning. Each county, city, regional agency, and special district that provides solid waste collection services within the county must plan for adequate capacity for recycling organic waste. So for today's presentation, we'll refer to this group of entities as the county, city, and CSDs. We may also say jurisdictions, and that means the same thing. So even those special districts that provide solid waste collection services within the county are defined as jurisdictions and are required to conduct capacity planning like the cities in the county. For the presentation today, we're going to be calling them something shorter because that's a mouthful. And regional agency has been removed from this presentation because there's no regional agency within Riverside County. So the county will lead this planning effort by coordinating with the cities and the CSDs. The county is responsible for establishing a collaborative approach, including a timeline, identifying tasks, helping delegate tasks, collecting organic waste recycling and edible food capacity report to CalRecycle. Collecting organic waste recycling capacity planning information from each jurisdiction and then submitting that in a report to CalRecycle. The county is responsible for identifying any jurisdiction, including itself, that doesn't have enough organic waste recycling capacity. And the county is responsible for informing any jurisdiction that does not have capacity about the time CalRecycle. The county is not responsible for ensuring each of the cities and the CSDs conduct the required organic waste recycling capacity planning. I will discuss this in more detail as what each jurisdiction is responsible for completing. The coordination might be done in a couple different ways, depending on what the needs and available resources are. For example, the county might lay out all of the tasks that need to be accomplished by each entity and the related timelines. They might organize an initial planning meeting with all of the jurisdictions, and during the meetings, the jurisdictions might determine tasks that could be conducted by smaller teams. The county might schedule a meeting to provide an overview of the CalRecycle tools and discuss what other data is available within the jurisdictions. The county could set up a process so that each jurisdiction can submit the data to the county, such as using Google Docs or some other system to submit the needed information, and they may check in with each jurisdiction periodically. The county might identify some tasks that it will complete for each jurisdiction. For example, the county might take the lead on coordinating with some of the required entities, such as permitted facilities. Next slide, please. So counties, in coordination with cities and CSDs, are responsible for conducting the requirements shown on this slide. And the purpose of the planning is for the county and each city and CSD to determine how much organic waste will be disposed within their jurisdiction, how much existing, planned, or new organic waste recycling capacity is needed for the organic waste material that is collected from its collection program. CalRecycle developed an extensive online calculator to assist in this part of the process. As the information is collected, the online calculator tool can be utilized to record and calculate disposal and projected disposal by material type, as well as existing capacity by facility type, new or expanded capacity by facility type, and any shortfall in capacity. The capacity planning requirements do not require estimates to be exact or absent of any error or uncertainty. Rather, it requires that each estimate is conducted in compliance with the requirements of the regulations. So the county is the coordinating entity for all the capacity planning tasks because the county is responsible for submitting the report on capacity planning to CalRecycle. Each of these tasks is expected to be done by each individual jurisdiction. Capacity planning efforts will be crucial to the state achieving SB1383's targets, and capacity planning requirements were intended to be cooperative and communicative throughout the entities in the county. So this slide shows there are 3 distinct tasks or parts of the organic recycling capacity planning. The first is each jurisdiction must estimate the amount of organic waste in tons that will be disposed by each of the jurisdictions within the county. Note that the jurisdictions that host facilities that generate digestate, such as in-vessel digesters and biosolids from wastewater treatment plants, are required to plan for the recycling capacity for these materials. The second step is each jurisdiction must identify the amount in tons of existing organic waste recycling infrastructure capacity located in the county or outside the county that is verifiably available to each of them. Each jurisdiction can demonstrate the capacity is verifiably available through a contract, a franchise, or other documentation of existing, new, or expanded capacity at a facility and activity, operation, or property that recovers organic waste and that will be available to the jurisdiction prior to the end of the reporting period. The third part of the planning is to estimate the amount of new or expanded organic waste recycling capacity that will be needed by each of the jurisdictions to process the organic waste estimated to be disposed by that jurisdiction within the county. This provides jurisdictions with the ability to identify how much additional capacity they will need at new or existing facilities that are either inside or outside of its boundaries, and it assists in identifying capacity at facilities that may become oversubscribed if other jurisdictions identify the same facilities. Because the effort requires regional coordination, each of the cities that are contacted by county staff must respond to the request for information within 120 days. This timeline ensures that the county staff can submit all the capacity planning information to CalRecycle in the time required by the regulation. So if this timeline is not met, the county does not need to include estimates for that city or CSD in its report to CalRecycle. However, the county must include in its report any cities that did not provide the necessary information to comply with the requirements. And again, the county is not liable if any of the jurisdictions do not respond within the given time frame. Next slide, please. So the county, in coordination with the cities and CSDs, is required to engage with important entities that play a role in organic waste recycling capacity planning efforts. And these are the LEA, facility operators and owners, and community composters. This engagement allows for more accuracy in determining organic waste capacity needed to meet the reduction in organic waste disposal goals required by SB 1383. In Riverside, the County Environmental Health Department is the LEA, so this one's an easy one for all of you because we have them here today and you'll be hearing more from them soon and we'll be able to ask questions and start this collaboration. The second group, consulting with haulers and owners of facilities, operators, activities that recover organic waste, is also required. If certain jurisdictions utilize the same existing facility or planned facility, then they may want to identify one person to consult with these entities to gather information on the existing or potential new or expanded capacity. And this was included in the regulations because a hauler or owner might be planning a project and the jurisdictions in the county may not be aware, or haulers or owners might be planning a project and they may not be aware what other projects are happening. And it facilitates conversations with the haulers and facility owners to identify opportunities for securing feedstock agreements. So any of the entities contacted by the county, city, or CSDs must respond within 60 days. And they must include information about the throughput and permitted capacity necessary for planning purposes. And this ensures that capacity planning requirements can be met in a timely manner with appropriate information. The third group that must be consulted with is community composting operations. And this provides an opportunity to consult with small-scale community composting operations that may be available to recycle additional organic waste outside of the conventional organic waste processing infrastructure that may be available. So this collaboration with community composting operations is necessary to provide CalRecycle the ability to ensure that all jurisdictions are involving local communities in their organic waste recycling capacity planning efforts. Next slide, please. So counties, in coordination with cities and CSDs, are required to conduct community outreach regarding locations being considered for new or expanded facilities, operations, or activities to seek feedback on the benefits and impacts that may be associated with new facilities. The intention for the community outreach is that it would be conducted by the jurisdiction in which the expanded or new facility, operation, or activity is located. With that said, as with other consultations, the county and the cities and CSDs should decide how and by whom community outreach will be handled if there is a new or expanded facility, operation, or activity. Counties can work in coordination with the local jurisdictions to provide the outreach, and nothing precludes cities from providing their own outreach. The outreach requirement was included in the regulations to facilitate feedback from the community during the planning process and to provide CalRecycle the ability to ensure that counties are involving local communities in their organic waste recycling capacity planning efforts. Community outreach must meet certain specifications to ensure thorough and authentic engagement on this requirement. The regulations specify the information and process for the outreach, including options for the format of the outreach. It specifies other entities that could be involved and details for outreach to disadvantaged communities that may or may not include outreach in additional languages. Community outreach is intended for the facilities or activities located within the county. Next slide, please. So if a jurisdiction's data determines that organic recycling capacity is needed, the county is required to notify the jurisdiction on or before the date the county submits the report to CalRecycle. Submits the report to CalRecycle that the jurisdiction is required to submit an implementation schedule to CalRecycle. The implementation schedule must demonstrate how the jurisdiction will ensure available capacity to recover the organic waste disposed by generators within their jurisdiction by the end of the report period. The implementation schedule must include timelines and milestones for planning efforts to access capacity, including obtaining funding for infrastructure through modifying franchise agreements or other means of financially supporting expansion of organic waste recycling. It must identify existing locations that could be used for additional capacity and identifying locations for proposed new or expanded organic waste recycling facilities that will be used. If a jurisdiction is required to submit an implementation schedule, then that schedule shall be submitted 120 days following the date the county submitted the report to CalRecycle. The county is required to notify each jurisdiction that lacks sufficient capacity that the county's reported a list of these jurisdictions to CalRecycle. Next slide, please. So for capacity planning, organic waste shall include only the following types of materials: food, green waste, landscape and pruning waste, wood, paper products, printing and writing paper, digestate, and biosolids. And as we mentioned earlier, jurisdictions that host facilities that generate digestate, such as in-vessel digesters, and biosolids from wastewater treatment plants are required to plan for the recycling capacity for these materials. A jurisdiction that receives a waiver from CalRecycle does not have to plan for organic waste capacity for the area that is waived. Capacity planning for locations that are exempted from providing required collection services are not required to be included in the county's capacity planning estimates, as those locations will not be contributing to the county's organic waste totals. Next slide, please. So each county, city, and CSD must conduct capacity planning requirements so the county can report to CalRecycle on the schedule shown on this slide. The first report to CalRecycle is due August 2022, then again 2 years later, August 2024, and then again every 5 years. And based upon the schedule here, the information that needs to be reported by the county to CalRecycle in the electronic annual report regarding organic waste recycling capacity planning and edible food recovery capacity planning requirements include the tons estimated to be generated for landfill disposal, the amount of existing capacity verifiably available to each jurisdiction, the amount of new capacity needed, the locations identified for new or expanded facilities, the jurisdictions that are required to submit implementation schedules, the jurisdictions that did not provide information to the county within 120 days. So if a county or city is required to submit an implementation schedule, it must be submitted by each individual jurisdiction to CalRecycle within 120 days following the date the county submits its report to the department. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's directly from the regulations. And with that, I would like to pass the baton to Greg Reyes with Department of Environmental Health.
Good morning. My name is Greg Reyes. I'm with the Riverside County Department of Environmental Health. I'm a program chief over a number of programs, but the one obviously we're talking about today is solid waste, or at least for this portion of the presentation. I'll be back again when we discuss the food section as well later. So let's talk in a broad scope about environmental health's role in this capacity planning. Where we sit in the spectrum is we act as CalRecycle's agent in terms of oversight for green waste and recycling operations that handle the material that your haulers are currently taking from your residents and your businesses. We're responsible for the oversight of organic processing sites like chip and grind, anaerobic digestion, and composting sites larger than 100 cubic yards or 750 square feet footprint. Now that's an important number because, as Jill was talking about earlier, there is a push also from CalRecycle to talk about community composting operations. These small scale sites below 100 cubic yards or the small scale footprint are usually these types of community garden or community composting operations. They do not fall under our oversight. So we do not know about all of these. We will occasionally get a complaint or a question about scale and operation and just confirm that these sites exist in space and time, but we do not track them and do not inspect them. Just for a sense of scale, this bin you're looking at in front of you is a typical large size bin you would see at a construction site or a large strip mall or market. This is a 40 cubic yard bin. So to give you a sense of scale of 100 cubic yards, think of this bin 2.5 times the size of this bin would be the maximum amount of material that's allowed to be on site for a community composting operation or a small scale composting operation to not fall under the regulations of the state and our oversight. Next slide, please. So as I said, we act as CalRecycle's agent. We issue permits that are CalRecycle's permits, or we are the oversight entity that make sure that your organic composting operations are being managed in a way that is consistent with state law, and they're built, designed, they meet the CEQA requirements, they have the proper operational documentation, and then depending on the scale of the site, we do anywhere from 4 to 12 inspections a year on any given site to make sure that they're maintaining those standards and being operated in a safe manner. So we can work with the jurisdictions to give you some sense of what the list is of sites that are around the county. We do have them listed on the Swiss. There's a database through CowerCycle called Swiss, Solid Waste Inventory System. It issues an ID number and tracks every system. It also has all the inspection reports available for review. We could provide those lists of sites to each jurisdiction for the sites that are close to them. Keep in mind, these sites are universally known by the haulers. They should know about every single site that we have in operation. Now, the one limitation of this is the bulk of the sites in Riverside County right now are green waste only operations. We have very few sites that do food capacity, or that have the ability to take anything beyond green material and start to take food waste or anything considered a food material or digestate. So some of that capacity planning is going to have to look at what do you think, and what does your hauler think that uptick in material is going to be in terms of how much extra capacity is needed, or what type of sites are needed to accept that capacity. We can give you the permitted capacity of a site, which means how much material they can keep on site at any one time, plus what their daily throughput is at the site. But what we won't have information on without talking to the site specifically is how much of that capacity is actually left, because most of the sites have existing contracts, either with haulers or with jurisdictions or other entities, maybe landscapers or other large companies that maybe are backhauling material. So they know how much of their capacity actually is available for additional hauling or additional recycling activities to those sites. So some of this conversation is meant to facilitate and start, as Jill noted, is to start a conversation. As you noticed, WRCOG is hosting this meeting, and we also have representatives from CVAG on the line. It is our hope, and I say our hope, the county and Department of Environmental Health, that we can partner with CVAG and WRCOG to work with the jurisdictions on this joint planning, because we obviously need to report all this information back to the state, but it will work much better for all of us if we're using a regional approach, because this is a big problem or a big mountain to climb of information. So it'd be better if we're all working together to provide this information in a uniform way. It'll make it easier for us to report it back to the state. It'll make it easier for us to provide information to you. So this will start, hopefully this starts to facilitate that conversation. So I don't have much more to say on that topic. So what we'd like to do at this point is we're going to open up to questions on just the organic capacity planning. Keep in mind, we are going to start talking about the food side, tier 1, tier 2, and the recyclers in the next section of our presentation. So if there are questions in terms of organic capacity or capacity planning, or questions about any of the terms, now's the time to ask them. You can either send those through your chat feature to Kyle, or raise your hand and Kyle will direct who's on the line at any given time. So Kyle, take it away.
I'm not seeing any questions generally. Does anyone have any? Feel free to unmute. It might be a scary risk.
Hello? I don't know if you can, I don't know if
I
you
hear
can.
you.
This is Keith Jones with Environmental Health Riverside County. I was wondering if Jill or someone from CalRecycle can elaborate a little bit more on the waivers, or if that's going to be covered later in the presentation.
Kara, do you want to take that?
Sure. Hey, thanks for the question. We weren't planning on diving too deep or at all into the waivers. Basically, the regulations allow for certain types of waivers. So for example, Riverside County will likely have areas of the unincorporated county that will be eligible, say, for a low population waiver. So with respect to capacity planning, if a jurisdiction has a waiver, they do not have to include planning for organic waste capacity for that area that's waived for the period of time that's waived. We'll be talking about edible food. Edible food, there are no waivers, so you do have to plan for edible food capacity. So does that answer the question? Do you want any more detail in that?
Oh, that's fine for now. Thank you.
You bet.
Looks like we have a question from Patrick Thomas.
Yeah, hi, this is Pat Thomas from City of Temecula. My question is, our hauler is CR&R, and our location for our organic waste is the CR&R facility in Paris, the anaerobic digester. And I assume other agencies are also utilizing that facility. I just wondered what other agencies are, and we're assuming that they have adequate capacity for our amount of organic waste, but I just wondered if that has been analyzed yet.
Patrick, to my knowledge, I don't know that we haven't had that conversation, particularly with CR&R. I know up to this point, they have analyzed their capacity as in terms of accepting green material and converting it. But in terms of the broad sense of extra material with organic collection as part of the element, I can't say, but that is one of the things that we would need to do as part of our planning efforts. So
Okay.
I'm sure, I'm knowing that site, because I've been to that site quite a few times, that's something that they're very keen to want to nail down, because every site has its capacities and it only has the ability to take so much material. So that's going to be a particular interest to them in understanding how much we estimate is needed versus how much capacity they presently have. So,
Okay, so that analysis still needs to take place.
to a certain extent, yes, and we're going to need to partner with, there's multiple city and county entities that I believe are taking material to that site. So there's going to have to be a pretty broad look at what extra capacity, and in this case, extra meaning basically it's the food element.
Right.
They've already been handling the green. So how much does that actually account for, and what is the flux in the current intake that they have available to manage that? So
Yeah,
that's something we should talk as a more regional, but we're going to have to get an idea from CR&R how many different jurisdictions are using that site, because I'm aware that there might be even some out of county sites that might have some capacity or have locked in some capacity at that site as well. So it won't just be Riverside County that will be vying for some of that capacity.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
Oh, can I just add one other comment? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, as Jill conveyed at the beginning, the calculator tool is something that each of the jurisdictions in Riverside County are going to need to utilize. So, for like your situation with CR&R, it'd be obviously very important to coordinate with CR&R as far as the amount of existing or expanded capacity, if they're going to be doing any expansion in the future, that would be available to your city. That data is what you will put into the calculator tool. And it's those certain pieces of data that you will then be providing to the county. With that said, though, and to Greg's point, as a group, as you start working on those calculations, as a group, if you start seeing that, some or all of the jurisdictions of Riverside County have an organic waste capacity gap, that's important, going to be important collaboration amongst all of you to be, really thinking about where is that additional capacity going to come from. Obviously, your haulers need to be an important part of that conversation, and many of them, as Greg noted, are planning for that. And again, the calculator tool, and the data that goes into it, it's based off of statewide characterization studies and population projections. And so it's an estimate. And we know that it won't be, it's not intended to be exact, but it's a planning estimate to look at growth in the need for organic waste capacity. So I did want to emphasize that, that each of you will need to do those calculations and eventually provide that data to the county. So I don't know if there's any questions on that. Greg, was that okay?
Nope, that's great. Thanks, Cara.
Yeah, I just
it looks like, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more comment on that CR&R facility is, in my understanding, is that they do have expansion capabilities. So, so thinking that, and is that able to be used as part of the capacity calculation?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yes. So any expanded capacity, any new capacity that will be coming online should be included in your calculation. So what triggers an implementation schedule is capacity that you don't know where it's going to come from. So it's not existing capacity, it's not expanded capacity or new capacity that you're aware of. That's what that delta, right? If there is a delta, and hopefully some of you won't have a delta, it's that capacity that triggers the implementation schedule. So absolutely include any expanded, or if, a new facility is coming online that you're going to have access to. Also, I think what's really important is that in the organic waste capacity requirements, it talks about having verified capacity. That verified capacity, again, that's why it's so important to be coordinating with your hauler. That verified capacity could be through your franchise agreement, could be through a contractual relationship that either your hauler has with the facility or that you have with the facility. That's not something that has to be submitted to CalRecycle, but it is critical that you have that capacity that's verified, instead of what we call wish capacity, is thinking about, hey, there's this facility over here and they've got capacity, therefore we're going to put that number into our capacity planning. It needs to be capacity, if it's expanded or new, that you're going to be able to access. So I hope that clarifies. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, and we don't want to gloss over those. So first one is from Kathleen Utter. Could an organic survey be generated that would allow the county to gather additional information? Kathleen, can you expand on that? What you mean by additional information? We're talking about a lot of different types of information here.
No, I just know for years ago when we did the LTF put together the green waste report that was sent to CalRecycle, and it was, I think our focus might have been just on the biomass, but if there's a way to survey each, and I think it would probably have to come from you because of the franchise haulers, to get more information on how much capacity they have available, how much they already have in contracts, and how much they have available, not just the amount that they have for the Swiss and the throughput.
That's definitely going to be an important element, and that's probably something when we start to have planning meetings, that's probably one of the first things that we as the LEA will have to do, is discuss that with our permitted sites and see what kind of excess capacity they have. And again, keep in mind, one of the glaring issues for us is that there is limited food capacity, at least in the county. There are plans, I know, with some of the haulers to move material outside of the county. We obviously don't have a lot of control there. So we're going to have to depend on our haulers to provide us some information on where they anticipate capacity and where they can anticipate some of those gaps. So it's going to have to be a conversation, not just between the jurisdictions, but with all of the franchised haulers within your jurisdictions to make sure that we're all talking about the same types of capacities and availability, and that we're not, again, as Kara noted, just because a site says they can take 200 tons a day and it's going to be a new site, they may have already booked 180 of those tons before they even built the site. So we need to keep that in mind as we talk about planning and moving ahead and what is or isn't expanded. And you're right, CR&R is permitted, as their current permit is written, they can expand that site, but the expansion of that site also takes 1.5 to 2 years before, to add each cell. So we have to keep those things in mind as well. It is not quick to add this type of facility to the system. So. Second question I see is, can environmental health provide all the cities with this list of sites that provide the organic recycling service? Absolutely. But I'd like to come back to, this is the reason we've engaged WRCOG and CVAG as entities to help us with facilitating data. And we'll discuss this more when we talk about the food recovery elements of this. But there's one of us, and there's 28 cities and 2 CSDs. So as much as I would love to talk to every single one of you, and we would love to talk to every single one of you, I don't want to have to distribute the same piece of information or various pieces of information 30 times and then hope I get back everything in the same vein 30 times. So we're going to work with CVAG and WRCOG on ways to facilitate information flow, and hopefully to keep the information being in a consistent format going out and coming back in. So it's easier for us to report back to the state once we figure out how it is we're supposed to report this back to the state, because I don't think at this point we have a real solid sense of what it's going to look like in the EAR, but we're going to try and make sure that we're structuring the data in a uniform way so that when we're ready for that and we have those conversations, we know how we need to tweak the data, and we can tweak it regionally and not just onesie twosies across the 31 potential entities that have to report data back. So.
And Greg, when we get to that point and later in the presentation, we can talk about what data the county will report, and that may help facilitate the conversation, what you'll want the cities to provide to you. I do want to emphasize, to Greg's point, again, the county's role is coordinating all of you, right? The county's responsibility is not to do this for you. Your responsibility is to be conducting your capacity planning, utilizing the calculator tool, communicating with your haulers and understanding what capacity is available. As a region, I think when it comes to a gap, that's something, you all need to be kind of talking to each other about. But again, I want to emphasize that, the county's responsibility is this coordination type of effort, and they're going to be taking it's really about 3 pieces of data that you'll be providing to the county, 3 or 4 pieces of data you'll be providing to the county that they're going to roll up into a total for the county of Riverside. Ultimately, the specifics of what went into your capacity planning, how you verified capacity, who you communicated and collaborated with, that is really in your court. The county is not going to be checking on that to see if what you provided to them was actually verified. For example, they're not responsible for doing quality control. The way this plays out is if each jurisdiction, let's just say worst case scenario, you make up the numbers and you give it to the county. The way it's going to play out is when CalRecycle conducts a compliance evaluation and we're looking at your programs and we're seeing, wow, there's no implementation of this aspect of your program. And we find out it's because there was no capacity planning. That's where the nexus comes to play. So just wanted to give Greg some support on the role of the LEA and the county in this effort. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you. Looks like there's one more question in the chat. Well, two now, I guess. First one, can you speak to the process of permitting a new food waste capacity? We've heard it may take many years and may not ever actually become approved. So from the acting as my hat as the LEA, as the local enforcement agency for solid waste, generally speaking, our process from application to a permit getting issued is really only supposed to last 6 months. Now, that being said, the biggest hurdle is always going to be land use approvals, CEQA, CUP, some other process, whatever your particular city uses. I would imagine probably a CUP process. In some cases, is it an EIR? Do they need amendments to an existing site? Are we talking about expansion or new facility? That land use approval is always going to be the longest part of any new or planned facility. So that is going to drive the rest of it. And then the question is going to be the parties that are coming in to put in a new site, what kind of feedstocks can they guarantee? Because an individual is not going to put a site in place if they don't know that they're going to have material to process. So these are some of the questions I can't speak to, but land use processes can take a long time depending on where and what type of site you're putting in. The NIMBY aspects of solid waste sites, not in my backyard, that comes up heavily. Prime example, one of our largest sites is out in the desert, Coachella Valley Composting. Very large scale site, sits on a closed landfill. They tried to expand, well, they did expand that site a few years back, but the first time they brought that forward for a change, there was a lot of uproar from the cities nearby, and they had to go through a full EIR process that delayed the project for 3.5 years. So those are the kind of things we can't predict. You in your cities can predict a little bit because you know the state of your constituents and where you may have problems putting particular sites. Beyond that, again, the CalRecycle, the state process, our process is mandated to take no more than 6 months once an application comes across our desk, assuming all those land use issues have been addressed. So, Sarah, did that answer your question pretty fully, or were there other elements?
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And then,
Hey, Greg, I got a hand raised, and then we gotta keep track on time. So if we could get
okay, no problem.
We could move on forward after you, Louis, and then thank you.
Hey, Greg, it's Louis Locasella, City of Marietta. So just wanted to say right at the bat, totally agree with you. We'd be happy to be able to share with you on the data side, and probably Western Riverside Council of Government would probably be the best person to help, bridge that communication between us and you guys. I did have a question though. Is the county looking at any new facilities on obviously county land that could help with the capacity?
I can't speak to that directly. I know that there is some small scale operations being considered at Badlands and Lambs Canyon. Keep in mind, my particular role is oversight. So I can't promote or run or try to get funding for a new facility. So in some of that planning, we can discuss, those sites are run by a different county department, waste resources. And perhaps when we have further conversations about this, we can discuss with them what are their plans to expand those particular sites. But those are the only efforts that I'm aware of from a county side in terms of expanding or at least providing some new operations.
Would you be willing to help cities communicate with those county departments, potentially looking at county sites? And if funding is an issue, then maybe cities could look into joining a JPA to help fund those new facilities? Absolutely.
I think that can definitely be part of the conversation we have, and that department is on the line right now, or is on this call as well. So they're hearing that. So when we move to the next stage of this and we actually talk about some nuts and bolts things, that can be part of our conversation. But thank you for bringing that point up.
Thank you.
So let's move on for the sake of time. We do have another big chunk of the presentation, so I'll kick this back to, I believe this is Malia's part.
Yes, it is. Hello, thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. My name is Malia Helms. I am the CowerCycle LAMD representative for a couple of jurisdictions in the Riverside County area, including Hemet, San Jacinto, Cali Mesa, Beaumont, Moreno Valley, City of Riverside, and the unincorporated area of Riverside. So I will be talking about the organic edible food recovery capacity portion of this presentation. So let's get right into that. So SB 1383 requires, can you go back to the last slide? Sorry. Thanks. SB 1383 requires that by 2025, the state must recover 20% of edible food that would have gone to landfills. And this is a statewide goal for California to collectively achieve. So the individual jurisdictions and individual food donors are not required to meet this 20% food recovery rate. And to achieve the statewide goal, the SB 1383 regulations require certain food donors to donate the maximum amount of their still fresh food that they would have sent to the landfills. So the regulations also require jurisdictions to implement edible food recovery programs to help increase food recovery throughout the state. And each jurisdiction's food recovery program must assess the current edible food recovery capacity. Jurisdictions must also actively expand and create new infrastructure to grow food recovery networks. So if you haven't started yet, you should begin assessing your community's current edible food recovery capacity, because in some communities, food donors may not have more food available to donate than food banks and nonprofits can accept. So the county will lead the edible food recovery capacity planning effort by coordinating with the cities. And the county is responsible for collecting the edible food recovery capacity planning information from each of the jurisdictions to submit the report to CowerCycle for both the edible food recovery and the organic waste recycling capacity as mentioned previously, and to identify any jurisdiction, including itself, that does not have enough edible food capacity, and informing the jurisdictions that do not have the capacity about the timeline for submitting an implementation schedule. And as mentioned before, the county isn't responsible for ensuring and enforcing that each of the cities conduct their edible food recovery capacity planning. So the coordination could be done in different ways depending on what the needs are, what the availability for resources are. And the key really is that the counties and the cities need to develop a plan for the tasks and timelines so that the county can submit the report to CowerCycle by the due date. So the ideas on coordination with organic waste capacity planning also apply to edible food recovery capacity planning. So a good example could be that the county could decide to contact the food recovery organizations and edible food recovery services that collect material across the county. And then the individual jurisdictions could contact smaller edible food recovery organizations and services that support only that particular jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go over the capacity planning requirements for edible food recovery. So the purpose of this planning is so that the county and each city to determine as much edible food will be disposed, or how much edible food will be disposed by commercial edible food generators, and how much existing, planned, or new edible food recovery capacity is needed to recover that edible food that's generated. To the county and each city, they're required to work in collaboration to collect critical information that will help produce an impactful edible food recovery capacity planning analysis. And even though this collaboration is needed, the county and each city are responsible for conducting the requirements that are on this slide. So the county and each city must estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed of by commercial edible food generators that are located within each of the unincorporated county and the jurisdictions within the county. So an estimate of the amount of edible food that will be disposed of by the Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators will allow each jurisdiction to make a meaningful assessment of how much additional capacity is needed to meet their edible food recovery needs. And to calculate this, one of the first steps would be to identify the tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators that are located within the jurisdiction. And although implementation by tier 2 generators isn't until 2024, in SB 1383, these jurisdictions are still required to develop a list of tier 1 and tier 2 generators and plan for capacity, as well as provide those tier 2 generators with education outreach by February 1st of 2022. And CowerCycle has created a guidance document for the jurisdictions on how they can identify tier 1 and tier 2 generators. So we've seen with jurisdictions that are currently doing this identification that it might not be as straightforward as they originally thought. So we really encourage you to get started identifying your generators now and send over any questions you have to your land representatives. So you might want to consider using the County Environmental Health Department food permit list to create your initial list of generators. And if your jurisdiction has access to business license data, it may help to cross-check the County Health Department food permit list to identify if there are any additional key metrics needed to determine if generators meet the thresholds. And then you can also search the companies on the County Environmental Health Department food permit lists in a NAICS code database or a purchase business list to find the NAICS code. And this will identify what generator category that business falls under. And you can filter businesses by the city, type of business, and revenue, and then you can refine that list using the specified tools, tips, and anything else you find in the guidance document. And later on in the presentation, I'll go over the tools and their links in this presentation for the tools. Next slide, please. So the counties and cities must identify as well existing capacity at food recovery organizations and food recovery services available to commercial edible food generators. And CowerCycle published a document that provides jurisdictions with guidance on how to do a survey to collect information from food recovery organizations and food recovery services. They must also identify proposed or expanded food recovery organizations and services that will be used to recover the edible food. So approaches to identifying new and expanded infrastructure includes talking to the existing food recovery organizations to find if they find out if they are planning to expand, and talking to the health inspectors that work in your jurisdiction to see if they may know of any new or planned food recovery organizations and food recovery services. Counties and the cities must also identify the amount of new or expanded capacity needed at food recovery organizations and services to recover the edible food. And because this effort requires the county to submit a report to CowerCycle, each of the cities that are contacted by the county staff must respond to the request for information within 120 days. So as mentioned before, this timeline ensures that the county can submit all of the capacity planning information to CowerCycle. And if the timeline isn't met, the county does not need to include the edible food recovery estimates for that city in its report. However, the county will include in its report any cities that did not provide the necessary information, and this just clarifies that the county isn't liable for any of the jurisdictions that do not respond within the timeframe. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, the county and each city and special districts need to decide if these tasks will be conducted by each individual jurisdiction or if there are some tasks that could be conducted by the county or by a group of cities. So the county in coordination with each jurisdiction are required to engage the edible food recovery organizations and the services that play a role in edible food capacity planning efforts. And it's critical that jurisdictions really work closely with these edible food recovery organizations to understand what infrastructure and capacity are needed the most. And with this collaboration, these organizations can inform the jurisdictions about what is needed to expand or create new capacity. So that might be staffing, facility needs, types of equipment, etc. And the county and each city should also determine who will contact the edible food recovery organizations and services regarding existing, proposed, or expanded capacity that could be accessed by each of the jurisdiction's commercial edible food generators. And entities contacted by a jurisdiction must respond to the jurisdiction within 60 days regarding available and potential new or expanded capacity. And this just helps jurisdictions conduct a collaborative edible food capacity planning analysis in a timely manner. Next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, organic waste capacity, the county's role is the same for edible food recovery capacity. So the county will establish an approach to this planning, including setting a timeline, identifying tasks, and determining what each jurisdiction's tasks are. And then they will also aggregate the data from all the jurisdictions, identify if any of them lacks capacity, report to CalRecycle, and then finally inform the jurisdictions that lack capacity of their responsibilities. So if a jurisdiction's data determines that edible food recovery capacity is needed, the county is required to notify that jurisdiction on or before the date that the county submits the report to CalRecycle, that it is required to submit an implementation schedule. And this schedule will demonstrate how it will ensure new or expanded capacity to recover edible food that's currently disposed by commercial edible food generators. And the implementation schedule will include timelines and milestones for these planning efforts, which include obtaining funding for edible food recovery infrastructure, and this can be through modifying franchise agreements or demonstrating other means of financially supporting the expansion of edible food recovery capacity. It can also mean identifying facilities, operations, activities, et cetera, inside the county that could be used for additional capacity. And each county and city is required to consult with food recovery organizations and services regarding existing, new, or proposed capacity that could be accessed by the jurisdiction's edible food generators. And as mentioned earlier, the jurisdictions can decide on how to coordinate this activity. And this coordination is necessary to really ensure that each jurisdiction has an understanding of the types and amounts of edible food that can be recovered and distributed for human consumption, as that's really the goal, and as well as the type of funding needed for increasing or building new capacity. And it's important to note that there are no waivers for edible food recovery, so all of the jurisdictions must plan and submit the required data. Next slide, please. So CalRecycle has developed several guidance documents and calculators to aid you in this capacity planning. There is a organic waste recycling capacity calculator tool. And on this slide, all of the tools are linked. So Kyle's going to send this presentation out later. And if you want to go back and look through the presentation and click on the links, you can do that. They're also located on the CalRecycle website and pretty easy to find through searching or going to the 1383 web pages. So for the organic waste recycling capacity calculator tool, it is a web-based tool and there are quite a few data input requirements. So plan ahead for this, look at the calculator before you decide to use it. There are a lot of inputs. It times out if you leave it for too long. So just plan accordingly for that. And there was a webinar on in the beginning of June for how to use this calculator tool, and we're waiting on a recording to be posted. So hopefully that'll be available for you guys soon. And for special districts, if any special districts are listening into this webinar, this calculator tool isn't able to provide specific data for special districts because the recycling and disposal reporting system, RDRS, doesn't allow for this specific jurisdiction of origin data. So we will provide guidance for how the county determines the special district's data to see if an implementation schedule is needed. And now for the edible food recovery capacity planning tools, there are quite a few. They're all linked on this slide. There's a guidance document for jurisdictions to help with the identification of Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators. There's a edible food recovery capacity survey tool, and this is a customizable tool. and is designed to survey food recovery organizations and edible food recovery services to gather capacity data. There's also an Excel-based edible food recovery capacity calculator tool, and there is also an associated guidance document for estimating edible food disposed. So those two go together if you need help with identifying where your food is being generated. You can use that document. So this tool for the capacity calculator helps determine the amount of potentially donatable food and the total capacity of material accepted by food recovery organizations. And for the calculator tool, once tier 1 and tier 2 generator types are inputted, the tool calculates the amount and types of potentially donatable food. So that is the end of my portion of the presentation. I'm going to pass it back to Greg Reyes.
Back again. All right, so let's talk about food recovery from the county side. First element is obviously we're going to discuss is tier 1 and tier 2 operations. The county environmental health also is your food inspection program for retail food facilities countywide. We've been looking at how to parse our data. Obviously, the state came up with their categories for what is tier 1 and tier 2, and that didn't mesh exactly with the way we permit facilities within Riverside County. So we've been presently undertaking the job of trying to parse our data down as close as we can to what tier 1 and tier 2 are considered under the CalRecycle rules. So we have our staff on our food side of the county looking at that data and trying to figure out if we can add an extra data field to further identify the sites as tier 1, tier 2, so we can more easily segment that data and distribute it out to jurisdictions who need it. One of our gaps in terms of data is we do not oversee wholesale. Wholesale is overseen by the state of California. You can get that information from the state with a records request. And so as I mentioned before, we're looking to partner with WRCOG and CVAG on information distribution. So an initial thought was to request wholesale operations for all of Riverside County and then distribute that information to the central point, or however we're going to distribute it through RCOG and CVAG, so that it can be distributed down to each one of your local jurisdictions, so you can see what wholesale operations are available. Now, you obviously can leverage your city zoning, planning, permitting system and just to identify sites as well. But retail, we've got that more or less addressed. We will work on distributing that information through RCOG and CVAG. We're working on the data cleanup, and it's the county's intention, and I say the county environmental health's intention, is to facilitate as much of the outreach and education portion on the retail side so that cities don't have to do that, because we're already in those sites. We have to do anywhere from 1 to 3 inspections a year on those sites. And so it doesn't take a lot of additional effort at this point, we don't believe, to do the annual outreach and discussions that are required in the reporting and collect that information electronically and distribute it back out so that each jurisdiction can report on their area. That's the plan at this point, and we're working in that direction. So the next we talk about this from a planning standpoint, we may have we'll have staff from our food side of the house who can speak a little more eloquently on how we're going to parse that data and how we're going to collect information on outreach and education. One of the big issues for us is going to be coming up with regional materials that we can distribute out to the entire, hopefully distribute out to all the sites within the county, because it's easier for our staff to just give the information out to all the sites as opposed to trying to figure out, well, we distribute in this city, but not in that city. It's easier for us to do that work at all the sites we inspect on a regular basis as it is. So that is our plan for this point for the retail side. Next slide, please. Food recovery is a little more complicated for us. We have been working on the food recovery side as a more of a feel-good program with the County Nutrition Action Partnership for a number of years, trying to promote food donations to our retail food operations over the years. Obviously, the switch to 1383 has changed that focus. There's a lot more attention paid in that area. So we are going through the CNAP database and through what information we have on sites inside and we're in the midst of trying to build out the complete inventory for Riverside County, again, with the intention to distribute that information through CVAG and WRCOG so that jurisdictions can use it. The biggest issue we're running into right now is we're an oversight agency. Everybody knows we're an oversight agency. So when we're reaching out to some of the smaller food recovery partners and agencies, they are hesitant to work with us to give us their information because there's a lot of information we didn't have in the system we had a number of these sites already booked, but we don't do their inspections. We just had them on the list so that we could distribute information to them. We didn't have information on capacities. We didn't have information on how much material they can take. Is it dry goods? Is it refrigerated goods? Can they take frozen? Can they take hot foods? So we've been working on that over the last year, trying to get that, or getting that information from some sites and making multiple efforts to get it on other sites for other locations. So when we have our next meeting, we can discuss where our gaps are specifically in terms of facilities, and if they're in a particular jurisdiction, we might want to ask for help from that jurisdiction to help us fill in the gap and getting that additional inventory information so that we have a better inventory data to distribute out to the rest of the county. Next slide, please. So, and I've said it multiple times, so ultimately this comes down to the reporting for the county and for the jurisdictions. And as Kara and Jill and Malia have noted, this is everybody's responsibility. The county has their piece through the unincorporated areas, but each city has to report on their area specifically. So again, being in that central role of having a lot of this data, we'd like to figure out a way to distribute that information logically out to the jurisdiction so you have it for your reporting and get it back logically. So we're going to partner with, the plan is to partner with CVAG and WRCOG on that data distribution. And I'm going to pause here for a second and let Trish and Kyle see if you want to speak a little bit to your plans on your side, or if we want to hold that over to later. But anyway, you should say hi to the group as it is, since we're at this point in the presentation.
Hi, Trisha here with CVAG. I'm the program assistant and I help coordinate our recycling roundtable. And I've had the chance to work with Greg and Kyle on this SB1383. And as Greg has mentioned, we're going to continue to work together to help coordinate information from Department of Environmental Health, but I think also in our discussions as a CVAG group or a WRCOG group, we can kind of feel what your guys' questions are, where you're having issues, and relay that back to Greg so that he's kind of hearing it from just a couple sources. If there's the same question over and over again, that they can try and address, and we can work with them to get the information. So you can feel free to reach out to me, my CVAG people, and I'll continue to work with Kyle and Greg. As you've heard, it sounds like there's going to be more meetings, more collaboration moving forward, and happy to be a part of that as CVAG.
Thanks, Trisha. And again, I'm Kyle Rodriguez with WRCOG. I want to just echo how important it is to make sure this is all streamlined. I know there's a lot of different interpretations of how we're going to be able to report it and listening into all the information. But when we put it back and submit it to the county, there's going to be more than 20 different versions. And that's what we want to try to eliminate, and making sure everyone's giving the same information to the county. So when it gets turned over, it's just processed a lot more simply. And in doing that, it's our responsibility working with WRCOG, CVAG, and all of our jurisdictions in making sure that information can stay consistent throughout the years. As Tricia said, if there are tweaks or questions or concerns, reach out to us, because you're probably not alone in having those concerns, and we can be sure to relay it to the right people and continuing and sharing it with our committees and our partnerships. So I'll pass it back over to you, Greg, and I think we can begin opening it open for questions.
Sure. So let me just clear up a couple of last things before we jump to questions. So as Tricia and Kyle pointed out, I think a key issue for us is going to be data standardization. So we're going to try and distribute the information through WRCOG and CVAG so that it goes out in one format and hopefully comes back in a similar format, so it's easier for us to process. Frequency of information, that's going to be a question I don't know that I have an answer for at the moment. Our data is live data, obviously. Whatever we're providing, the inspections we're doing, if staff did an inspection in the field today, I can have that information for you in the morning. That's the way we sync our data and how live our data is. If a new site comes online, place closes out. So the inventory is going to be changing fairly frequently. That's what happens in the food world. That things move pretty steadily. So we'll have to come up with a frequency of when we distribute information so that we know what space and time it is we're reporting against. And it may not be 100% accurate by the time we post a report, but we're just going to have to deal with space and time of the data. That's how it's going to work. So from a standpoint of communication, if you have questions for the county, as you can see, I'm listed there as there's my, that seems rivco.org. Got that wrong. that last, ignore that last page. So for now, if you could go back to that one slide, the last slide of mine, you can either email me, which my email is there, and or Sandy Salas, she works with me, and we can try to answer some questions for you. But we would like to get some other meetings set aside so we can talk in more detail about the data. So with that, I'm going to open up to questions, and the first one I see is in the chat. How soon will DHS have a list of tier 1 and 2 food recovery entities and food recovery entities available for cities? We have lists that we can provide right now. Like I said, our tier 1 and tier 2 is not very clean because our categories do not line up well with the state. So we were discussing recently with our food side of the house about going through an effort in the next month or two of looking at those sites and trying to get a much cleaner list of tier 1 and tier 2. We can provide you with a list now, but it may encapsulate sites that ultimately don't fall under tier 1 and tier 2 in the grand scheme. So if you want a broad list, we could give it to you now, but if you give us a month or two, we're going to have a pretty clean list that'll be, I'll say, in the high 90% of certainty that it's a complete list. It's accurate to the tier 1, tier 2 facilities. Food recovery sites, we have a pretty solid inventory. What we're lacking is the information on capacities at a lot of sites, and that's where we're struggling to get information. So we could give you the sites, maybe not the capacity information. And again, I'm sure out of this, there'll be other meeting. We'll have a follow-up to this where we get into particulars and we can discuss what we have, and maybe we can show a base run of that information as we have it right now. So, Julie, that was from Julie Trent. Did I answer your question, Julie?
Yes, Greg, I was just going to actually ask if you, in the meantime, I know you're still developing these lists, but in the meantime, if you wouldn't mind providing what you do have so that we can kind of at least have some baseline of where these are and who they are. I think it'd be helpful.
Sure. And you know, I don't want to say we've been hesitant to provide that. One of the limitations on our data besides tier 1 and tier 2 is, I don't know if you guys are all in your nice handy little jurisdictions. When you deal with a county-wide, the variability of addressing is always a problem. Like I can't pull from my list and tell you everything that is or is not in a city jurisdiction, because things that sit just outside your city line may also have the city name on their address. So that's some of the cleanup part that we've been talking about with CVAG and WRCOG, about maybe finding a way to put a GIS layer over the top so we can have cleaner data in that respect. So that's one of the struggles we have with the data, but we can talk about an early run of the data just so you have a general sense of how many sites might be in those tier 1 and tier 2 lists in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, because we are working on generating our own list at this time, and to have some comparison as to what you have to that might help us narrow those things down.
Sure. Well, let's have some follow-up after this, and we'll talk about getting something out to the group.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Kyle, you're the only one who can see the hand, so I don't see any other messages in the chat. So
I got a question from Jill, actually.
Hi, everyone. It's not a question. I just wanted to elaborate that I'm really glad that Julie asked that question, and really thankful for Greg for sharing all the information that, you know, they have that can get the city started. I just want to reiterate, it's each individual city's responsibility to identify their tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators. And getting those initial lists from the county are great. What we're hoping the outcome of today is each city and each jurisdiction will know who the contact is for identifying their tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators. They'll know what resources and tools they have available to them. They'll collect all that information and get started on it. I would hate for any of the jurisdictions to wait 1 or 2 months for the county to refine some lists, because I do encourage you all to get started on that, because we've been working with San Diego County and we're finding, you know, there are a lot of nuances in identifying tier 1 and tier 2. So I really encourage each of the jurisdictions to get started on that soon. And Kara?
Yeah, hey, Jill, I just want to add though, you know, to add a fine point on Greg, and I am super impressed with what Greg and the team is doing. And I do think, you know, I hear to Jill's point, you know, it is getting going. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of efficiency that we have found by utilizing the Department of Environmental Health list. And so while, you know, and Greg, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you kind of estimate as timing, but, you know, if it does take another month or so, it is a much more efficient approach to utilize and start, and you'll see this in our guidance document, to start with environmental health, their list. And so I really encourage that from an efficiency perspective. While there are some things that you can get going on, such as requesting from CDPH, if you want, to get the list of wholesale food vendors and food distributors that are located in your jurisdiction, you could certainly do some of those things. I think particularly, again, just emphasizing, you know, it is so critical what we have found from an efficiency perspective to start with environmental health lists versus other commercial databases, et cetera. So, you know, you probably have enough that you could get going on your organic waste capacity planning, and maybe that's where you start, and maybe waiting for Greg and the team to get you the data that they're working on. Greg, is there any kind of more specificity to timeline? Because I mean, personally, I just really want to emphasize the need to utilize environmental health list, and the extra effort that you're going to of lining it up with tier 1 and tier 2, I think is phenomenal. And actually it's gonna, it may, like, you may not be able to get that to folks in whatever time frame that is, but in the end, actually, it's gonna expedite things from my experience in working with a lot of counties. Greg?
Right. So we're not far. So keep in mind, we work worked on the fiscal year, the fiscal calendar ended in June. So there was a big push with staff to get certain things done. That's a functional side thing for us. But when we ran the base list last year, we realized we ran into these gaps, and that our tier 1 and tier 2 didn't line up exactly. We think we have a plan for cleaning that up, and it won't take us more than a month or so to do that. And the plan was to start it sometime in mid-July, because we finally got past that fiscal year into hopefully by the end of August, we have this all cleaned up. The goal was to get those lists to those individual inspectors, and they can quality check it and tell us if those things meet those tiers. I think for us, the long term is trying to find a way to identify those in our data set so that they're easier to pull out later. But right now, our attempt is to clean up the data as much as possible and weed out false positives in that initial query, so that what we give you, like I said, is in the 90 percentile clean list of what is tier 1 and tier 2 as far as we're concerned. Because again, we have staff that are going into those sites multiple times a year, so they understand once we give them that scale. We just haven't turned it over to those staff yet because they were busy getting us through the end of the fiscal year. So the plan is in the next couple of months to have those lists very tight and very clean and available to then distribute out to the remainder of the group. So whatever I give you right now, it'll be a list. It'll be a little dirty and probably, hurt my OCD a little bit that it's not quite what it could be. And, like Kara said, just give us maybe until the end of August, and then I think we'll have a very clean list that we can distribute out to everybody, and you'll have a real solid understanding of what's available in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, so I think that time frame, Greg, is very fits well, is totally doable with still meeting the time frames that are going to need to be met. So, I just really encourage you. I think that's reasonable. End of August to get the list, because I think in the end it's going to be far more efficient. You're actually going to save time, so you're not going to be behind the 8 ball. The other thing I wanted to share, and Greg, I'll have you kind of add on to this, is edible food capacity planning is more so needed to be done as a whole group. With organic waste capacity, you have your haulers, they have maybe secured capacity. It's a little bit more definitive by, boundaries, whereas edible food is less so. And so this is, I think, going to be really important to get the edible food collaboration amongst all of you going, and hopefully completed in time for each of the cities to be working whatever might be needed in the way of funding additional capacity into your fiscal year budget for next year. I say this is the approach that a number of counties are taking. They're taking more of a county-wide approach to edible food capacity planning, because when it comes to trying to, specify that a particular city is lacking edible food capacity, it's just a lot harder to do, because these food recovery organizations tend to operate, all over the county. So I'm kind of putting that out there, that I think this is a direction that all of you will end up needing to go. Again, this reemphasizes the need for Greg and the team to be identifying the tier 1 and tier 2 and getting data from the food recovery organizations and services on capacity. And as Greg noted, he may need some of you to talk to some of those, especially maybe smaller food recovery services or organizations, to get that data. But I think once you get all this data, you all are going to need to come back together to see, is there a gap? Meaning that you don't have enough of identified existing, expanded, or new capacity. And as a group, it may come down to you identify that there's a delta, that there's this much extra capacity that's going to be needed to meet the tier 1 and tier 2 generator needs. And I think as a group, you all are going to need to figure out how you divvy up the funding that's needed to achieve that expanded capacity. We have a number of counties that are taking this approach, including Yolo County, Santa Clara County. I think it's an approach that probably is where San Diego County is going to go. So a number of counties are taking this approach. So Greg, I'll turn it back to you, but I wanted to kind of give that, what's going to be the next step for all of you. And I think what's critical is if you can get this planning done, the calculations done, it's going to help all of you in determining how much additional capacity needs to be funded and really working to get that into city and county budgets for next fiscal year. Why I say that, and then I'll switch it to you, Greg. Why I say that is if you can get into your budgets for the coming fiscal year, so next fiscal year, then that is capacity that you've identified that you're going to be expanding, or new capacity for that matter. That will not trigger an implementation schedule. So I think this is why, being proactive in this planning and figuring out what your needs are and how you're going to fund it, then that can go into your calculations and it won't trigger an implementation schedule. So Greg, I'll turn it back to you.
Are you sure? It's not just one more point? No, thank you, Kara. One point I want to make, and I'm not sure if I made it when we went through the first part of the presentation. Food recovery sites, we have them, we're creating a list. We do not inspect those sites. We have no oversight there. So one of the elements that we're going to need the jurisdiction to make sure that you're handling is the outreach and the discussions on the ground with those sites. Because we don't have any hook there, and intentionally so. We don't want to dissuade food recovery efforts. So on most of these sites, we're not going to be a present site, which is part of the reason we're having trouble getting information back from people, because they're afraid that at some point we're going to change our mind and start doing oversight. But that being said, yes.
Greg, on that point, I'm glad you raised that, because that is something, if environmental health is not conducting food permit inspections on those food recovery organization services, the inspections are going to be required. So each of the individual jurisdictions are going to need to figure out about inspections on those entities. And so that's an additional planning piece that you all kind of need to come out with this. And I think I also wanted to emphasize, because Greg, you mentioned the inspections that are required do not have to be on any specified frequency. So there's a lot of flexibility in Article 14 on the enforcement and inspection section of the regulations that allow you to set that frequency and prioritization. So that gives environmental health some flexibility. You get to continue to do the schedule that you do and tag in, the inspections, the pieces of the regulation that you need to check on, which is that record keeping. And then if jurisdictions have to do additional inspections, it's going to be something to think about. And lastly, Greg, some of the jurisdictions like San Mateo County, and this may be a place where the COGS want to go, is they are joining together for the inspections that they as individual jurisdictions need to do. And they're kind of pooling their resources. They're looking to hire an individual that would do the inspections for all of the jurisdictions. So, again, Greg, these are the kinds of conversations that will come out in the next couple months with all of, the county and the jurisdictions, figuring out not just capacity planning, but how are we going to do inspections? And to your point, education of these entities. Back to you, Greg.
Right. Thank you. So just so you know, though, our ultimate plan is, since we're already in the food facilities at least 1 to 3 times a year, our goal with the tier 1 and tier 2 sites is to distribute information once a year to those sites on the regular. It's going to be too hard for us to try and work on any off schedule. We'll just make it a regular occurrence that we notify our offices and let them know this is the time frame when we're going to do those 1383 elements with your inspection. Remind all the staff that when they go out and do those sites to make sure they get those hits in those particular locations. But beyond that, I want to open the floor. Are there any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. Anybody with raised hands, Kyle?
I don't see any raised hands, Greg.
Well, then I will say from the county side, thank you for your time. And obviously there's more conversations to come, and turn it over to Kyle and Cal Recycle to close it out.
All right. Thank you again, Greg. Jill, would you like to say a quick few words before heading out?
Sure. I just want to thank everybody very much for attending today. Thank you, Kyle, for hosting. Thank you, Greg, for all of the great information, and Tricia with CBAG for hopping on here, and everybody just coming to the table to start this is really exciting. I'm very pleased. Thank you.
I'm only going to echo that. Thank you again, all of our speakers, everyone here for attending and joining. We're going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint and the recording sent over to those that attended. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you, everybody.